Well, welcome to the Carnegie Endowment and to our discussion about the rise of political violence in the United States. While not a happy topic, I'm very happy to introduce it with two of my favorite people in the world, Christian Davenport and Nealin Parker. Christian is the Marianne and Charles R. Walgreen Professor for the Study of Human Understanding, which has got to be the best professorship, Christian, the Study of Human Understanding at the University of Michigan. He's also a faculty associate at the Center for Political Studies and a research professor at the Peace Research Institute, Oslo. And his research institute interests are really global. They include political conflict, measurement of political conflict, racism, and popular culture. He's done everything from writing graphic novels to designing board games and written more articles than I think I've written letters. So that's Christian in a nutshell. Nealin Parker is the executive director of Common Ground USA, the brand new initiative at Search for Common Ground, the world's largest dedicated non-governmental organization dedicated to peace all over the world. Prior to that, she founded and co-directed the Bridging Divides initiative at Princeton University. And she had a really short bio online, but prior to that, she was working at the US government, where she's done everything from chief of staff in housing to being the acting director of OTI, the Office of Transition Initiatives, where she worked on peace and conflict all over the world. And so we're just incredibly proud and glad to have Christian and Nealin here to discuss these issues with us. I'm going to start with just 3 slides to introduce the paper that I'd written on the rise of political violence in the United States and just give us some grounding in some of the data. And then we'll just open it up to a discussion amongst the 3 of us. We'll talk together for about half an hour, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. Please send your questions in to the chat function, and our fabulous Savannah and Marissa will take that information and send it on to me, and then we'll try our best to answer your questions. So the rise of political violence in the United States is not a news-created phenomena. It's a very real phenomena. You can see it in the data. This is from the Global Terrorism Database. Basically, the US had a big spike in terrorism in the 1970s. It was mostly from the left in the 1970s. It was mostly violence against property, and it very much didn't hit people particularly. It was a lot of bomb threats called in the middle of the night to places that were empty. A handful of people, I mean, everyone knows about the Weathermen and so on, but a very differently organized kind of terrorism than today. And I'll talk about that in a minute. What we saw was that violence in general went down quite a bit. For about 50 years, it was organized as small groups on the fringes, and then it just started spiking. And you can see that in the numbers here. It starts spiking in 2013. It rises a little bit. In 2017 is really this huge spike, and it's pretty much on the far right. You see some single issue, but really quite a bit on the far right. There's really just no comparison. So we're not going to talk about both sidesism. We can talk a little bit about what's motivating the far left terrorism, but it's just not worth it. The data just doesn't support it. Next slide. So what we're seeing in the change in violence in the United States is that what used to be violent fringes outside of politics have moved to the inside. Now, let me caveat this, because I'm sure Christian will correct me if I don't. The United States is unusual among consolidated democracies in how much political violence we had within our system for most of our democratic history. And no one here is going to forget that the Jim Crow South existed as a one-party state with about 11 of our states held together as one-party states that weren't democratic by the threat of violence from the states and from citizens who were used to allow violence to happen and keep people from voting. That ended in 1965, and very quickly, as soon as the Civil Rights Act passed, what you saw was that violence moving into citizen groups. But those citizen groups did tend to be on the fringes. So the violence moved from the states to citizens, and the fringes tended to be outside of politics. So what I'm talking about in this slide is from the 70s onward. And what you saw was about 50 years of political violence in the United States that was violent. It was not good. It was things like the Oklahoma City bombers, but they were not deeply connected to politics. They were ideological movements that were not connected to the two main political parties. What we've seen in the last 5 years is that this has changed quite a bit. What we've seen is two big groups of violence that have become quite connected to our political parties again, and in a way looks more like pre-1965 Jim Crow or even Reconstruction era violence, which is what I argue in the paper. The two groups are this. First, a group that we've long associated with terrorism and with criminal violence: young, unmarried, jobless men who are searching for belonging. This is incel violence. This is spontaneous hate crimes. These tend to be young men in their 16 to early 20 years, and they tend to be pretty disorganized. And we know this group in our violence studies, and we see them all over the world committing violence. What's pretty new is this second group. These are people who are in their 30s, they're married, they have kids, they have jobs, they're actually more likely to go to church, they're more likely to belong to community groups. These are people who are committing more organized violence. So the January 6th violence, violent doxing, violent threats against school board members, against health officials, the kinds of stop the steal violence that we've seen. Now, that hasn't been a whole lot. Most of the protests in 2020 were nonviolent, but the violent ones that we're seeing, the organized violence, is more this older group of people. What does seem to unite them is a fear of women, minorities, and they're disproportionately evangelicals as well as white males. I want to caveat evangelical a little bit because Ryan Berg, who's a scholar of political religion, he's also a pastor himself, has noted that evangelical has been a title that's become used by people who want to associate with the conservative right, whether or not they're evangelical Christians. So you're seeing Jewish people call themselves evangelicals, Catholics calling themselves evangelicals. It's become a word that people use as a political label as much as a religious label. So I think we have to be really careful when we use it to recognize that. What's different about these groups of people is that they are very connected now to the political mainstream. They see themselves not just as the anti-abortion activists that might lean right but are denounced by the mainstream, but to being very connected to a portion of a political party. And as we see in the Kyle Rittenhouse trial right now, they're also celebrated by the political mainstream, and we're seeing that celebration of violence and things like the Gosar censure that just happened yesterday. Last slide. So in the paper, I trace 4 global factors that elevate the risk of electoral violence. And these are things that we see in research from around the world that make political violence in the electoral realm more likely. Highly competitive elections that can shift the balance of power, partisan divisions based on identity, electoral rules that enable winning by exploiting identity cleavages, and weak institutional constraints, especially security sectors that are seen to lean to one side so that people believe that if they commit violence, they won't be arrested. This is your typical Jim Crow South situation where white mobs couldn't get arrested, couldn't get tried by white juries and so on, knew that they would get off. We're now seeing all 4 of these in the United States, and in the paper I trace why we're seeing all 4 of these, how the sorting of our political electorate has led to white identity salience being much higher on one part of our political spectrum, and why the competitiveness in our elections is causing this elevated risk of electoral violence, and why it's important to not just see the electoral violence that we're seeing in the United States as a purely social phenomena. The paper I'm writing right now actually is the causes of political violence. And there's a lot of causes. Any complicated issue has a lot of causes. You know, there's the issue of guns, there's the issue of social media, there's the issue of identity sorting, and all sorts of things in the United States. But I really don't want us to lose sight of the fact that it serves political interests in the United States right now to highlight identity. And it particularly serves the political interests of a party that has sorted itself into a homogenous, white, and largely male party, to highlight things that matter to that traditional hierarchy. And while highlighting those things in the past, that kind of dog whistling in the past simply was dog whistling, and it might have been ugly, but it didn't necessarily lead to violence, there are reasons now in the level of social sorting and the level of competition and so on, where we can expect violence from the same political activities. And I think we're seeing those norms degrade in our congressional level, but we're especially seeing them degrade at the state level. And I think it would be fair to start expecting more violence if we don't start rebuilding our norms and our institutions, particularly our security sector institutions, which I see as the real bulwark against violence, and which are very much trending in the wrong direction in the United States and have a history of trending in the wrong direction in the United States. So with that cheery set of thoughts, I'm going to take down the slides, please, and let's just open it up to a discussion. I don't expect my co-discussants here to agree with me. We can have a real solid discussion here. And I'll start with Christian. Christian, you write a huge amount about the relationship between the state and how the state affects citizen violence. And I'd really love for you to talk a little bit about how you see the situation we're currently in and what got us here.
Thanks, Rachel. And the piece that you wrote is definitely worthy of folks reading it and giving a lot of reflective kind of consideration. And so, in that spirit, so a lot of the paper, not to focus my comments there, but it's useful to think about a lot of the kind of discussion, kind of like post 1000 or post 2000. Post World War II, kind of like where your starting point is post 1865. I mean, where your starting point is to think about trajectories. I think it's very useful to think about, and like much of your article is kind of like non-state behavior, right? So, and so I'd like to kind of bring the state back in and think that we need to kind of consider both sides concurrently, because, and this we kind of talked about, right? So this is externalization of our conversations. You have protests, you have rebellions, riots, you have everyday resistance, you have insurgency, and then you have the state countering version of it, which always seems like, you know, the state didn't start it, the state's just responding. And so we do have these two sides that are kind of going at it. And what's interesting is what you see is this kind of co-evolutionary dynamic that kind of emerges over time where, so for the post-2000s, when we see this kind of emergence of the right, I would suggest that the state helped create that because of earlier facilitation of the right. They weren't going after them as aggressively as they were in devastating and destroying the left. They were facilitating some of their institutions through infiltration, actually. They were not infiltrating them in the same way. They were not targeting them the same way. They were not assassinating people in the same way. And so they were allowing the right to basically be cultivated and allowed to exist. And so if you think of kind of individuals, institutions, ideas, and interventions, behavior, there's been historically, at least since the late 1800s, early 1900s, a devastation and elimination of the left, which is kind of why we don't have it. So I'm always surprised when people talk about the left. I'm like, what left are you talking about? Because that's not at all what we used to have. And thus the emergence of this right that we see is now kind of, that some see as problematic, because not everyone does, right? So those ideas were allowed to facilitate. Many of those individuals were allowed to be continuing to distribute their information. Many of their institutions were not devastated and destroyed in the way that much of the kind of like historical political left has been treated. And many of the behaviors that they engaged in were also facilitated, even some violent ones. And so this then becomes important for us to kind of understand that what we're seeing now is this emergence of these individuals' ideas, institutions, and interventions that were effectively facilitated at local, state, and federal levels previously. And the IR scholar in me has to mention that in part because of US interventions and militarism abroad, many of these folks come back and then find themselves, in a sense, lost. And they find their way into many of these institutions and activities and follow individuals. And again, we've helped create the United States government and the United States economic elite have helped facilitate some of these individuals that we now see as problematic. So I just don't want to make it seem as if now they're here, now they're problematic, and the United States government didn't have anything to do with cultivating them, facilitating them, training them, letting them loose. Because now that's the kind of co-evolutionary dynamic that we found ourselves in. And so I wanted to kind of contextualize that whenever we have these conversations to get some sense of the thing that we see as a problem now is the thing that we helped create through prior activities and choices that were made at earlier historical time periods.
It's a really important point, Christian. And my article is already way too long, and Will Dobson and Larry had to cut it down. But you're really right. I remember last year during the election, I was trying to look into the use of the military on U.S. soil against U.S. forces. And actually, the largest number of times the U.S. military was used on U.S. soil, and I think we've actually talked about this, was union busting and anarcho-syndicalist busting and so on in the early 1900s and 1920s. And I think that's what you're talking about, is this sort of destruction of that part of the left, and it's almost evolutionary. And Ari Perliger writes about that too, in Israel and Germany, about how you tend to see states being less harsh on the side that they kind of want to, on the terrorist side that they kind of favor. And so it's not just us. Nealin, Search for Common Ground works all over the world in much harder situations, or situations that look much harder. I mean, given this long history that Christian and I are now discussing, I think the United States might take a harder look at just how easy our situation looks. But Uganda does not look particularly easy right now. Kenya and the other places that Search works in, and other hotspots. And you personally have worked in very tough spots all over the world, and now you're turning your gaze to the U.S. How do you think the U.S. is stacking up to other countries right now? How worried should we be?
You have to start off on mute. That's a prerequisite for this sort of thing. First of all, thank you for having me. Thank you for writing this article. Thank you for what it can do to catalyze thinking around that, because as a person who works on how to mitigate political violence, one of the first pieces is raising awareness of it on a time frame where you can do something about it. And this is related to, how does the United States stack up? The United States is not a failed state in the categorization of failed states. As an overall state, it has a functioning system more than a number of states around the world, and is also not a country at war. And I think it's important to say those things, despite the fact that there are some people who live in an experience of constant violence in this country, because it means that the things that we can pull on, the assets that we have, are distinct. And this is not to say that we are in a good place. The United States is the most decreased in terms of its peace by some measures in the last year in the world, and that's a very significant fact. We are, for the way that I see it, is not as much how much violence is happening, but where are we in a risk bracket? And I think that it's really important that you and Christian started with the fact that this violence has been going on for a long time, because even the definition of what is political violence is something that I think we should be very explicit to say that is violence with a sort of power dynamic that has existed and had different words attached to it, but that has an incredible history of racial violence in this country that I actually don't think that we have good data on. So the question of how much violence is happening now versus before is a little bit hard to pin down. But what we are seeing is the hallmarks of an increased risk bracket for violence. So decreases in the fundamentals of a democracy, decreases in trust in the security sector, in government, in elections, in media, in each other, that are at a fairly steep curve. In that space, the fact that then we have economic shocks, like the pandemic, like the Great Recession in the 2000s, and that we continue to not have addressed some of the underlying causes of our divisions around race and opportunity, religion, ethnicity. All of these things continue to put us in a space where I think we should be very concerned. These are the kinds of things that start search programs in other countries, and in fact are the sorts of things that we were seeing in the United States that are the reason that search has begun programming here in the United States. But I think on top of that, I go back to where I started, which is that we also are a country with a lot of assets and a lot of opportunities. And it is on us to see this very, very significant trajectory and take steps to move a different direction.
That's why I love including Nealin in any very deep and depressing conversation, because she always finds a way to lift it up at the end. But first, I'm going back to Christian, because we need to deepen the downward trend first, Nealin. So we've got this long history of violence from the state that was picking a winner, basically, and which extremist side would win. Not saying, I'm not going to say, you can say, which extremist side you think was better. I tend to be against violence of all sorts, but certainly which extremist side was going to come out higher. We've also said we're not at war. We have a functioning state. We do have these other assets to pull on. Although a functioning state within a democracy means that, as I write about, we're getting electoral violence. We have a state that's worth fighting over. And that's a pretty big prize. It's a presidential system, and a first past the post presidential system. And those institutional factors make violence more likely, because just a couple of people on one side or the other can turn a whole election. Christian, I'm writing about electoral violence, but you, of course, write about all forms of violence. So what other forms of violence do you think are contributing factors to this situation that we need to be taking into account here?
Yeah, we're gonna have some trouble. So I'm gonna disagree with Nealin right now. We are at war. The United States is at war. The United States is at war domestically. The United States is at war internationally. Some call it empire, some call it imperialism. Many people call it different things. And so if we're creating countries to help extract resources, I think we're at war. But staying domestically, I'll get back to international. But so my problem with the kind of election violence literature is that it's privileging a particular type of event and then looking a little bit before and a little bit after, and missing the broader trajectory of all activities undertaken generally beyond that particular scope, right? So we know that you might change your repertoire of activities as you're approaching and then following the event, but it's just like, okay, those events happen n number of months or years apart. What about the rest of the time? And if you're like withholding killing people until the election, then afterwards you're like, okay, now we can pick people off again, or now we don't need to pick people off because we picked them off on the way up. Then if you're parsing election violence, that would lead you in a particular direction, right? So I'm generally one to kind of look at the broader repertoire of activities. So protests, terrorism, rebellion, riots, insurgency, everyday resistance, and on the policing side, on the state side, policing efforts and counter all of it, counter-terrorism, counter-protest, counter-rebellion, counter-insurgency, and then eliminate this whole counter logic, because it's just like states aren't just responding to activities, they're preempting, and so that whole element. And so when you're putting stuff in context, then we're then looking at repertoires, and then from my perspective, it's how does an election or proximity to an election shift the repertoires of both challengers and states, and where does that take us? The big thing that's missing from my perspective is economic violence, right? And so the definition you give of political violence, I'd say, is similar to this idea of economic violence, was physical and psychological harm imposed by the state and non-state actors, and this kind of drills down to your point, influencing who benefits from and can participate in politics, economics, and social cultural dynamics. If you're broke or starving, or psychologically depleted, or worried about getting shot, you're not going to participate in much. And the system is not for you. And so I think from that perspective, firings, suspensions, I mean, this increases the number of actors we need to look at, but I think it's definitely, speaking to kind of like where Nealin was going as well, it's just like, as we talk about why this reservoir of young people are willing and able to kind of jump into certain type of activities, well, when you go back to like Bluestone and Harrison and talked about deindustrialization and so forth, if you have these mass firings and people are just now left with no purpose, no work, no sense of being or meaningfulness, then they're susceptible to cues and other types of mobilization strategies to get caught up in other things. And so I think the economic violence helps us understand the political violence.
We're going to have to talk more offline, Christian, because it's a logic that makes absolute sense, but I've never been able to find the research that supports it, that supports the connection between the economic violence and the political violence in terms of the people committing the violence, having ties to economic loss, unemployment, job loss.
Think of Detroit, right? Think Detroit's perfect. So the Pinkertons helped develop the security apparatus to kind of keep people in check. And then when they got it institutionalized, they handed over what the Pinkertons were doing for the companies to the state. The state then handled it. But then as they wanted to restructure things in the 70s and 80s and start firing individuals, then that passing forth between what the corporate security forces were doing and what the state security forces were doing, which happens abroad as well, right? So that swapping kind of happens. And so what happens is normally people aren't looking at both simultaneously to see that exchange. But definitely, Badges Without Borders, Nicole Siegel's book on violence workers, they're highlighting these similarities, I think. So there are
I completely agree with you on that. I mean, I write about it too in A Savage Order, the sort of connections between the economic elites and the political elites and the violence that they're unleashing. But in terms of our current violence right now, if you look at the people in the United States who are committing violence and the economic factors, 2008, the poverty, the diseases of despair, the various things that you would think of as economic causes of the violence right now, I just don't see any of the causation that you would expect to see. What I see is the racial causation, but not.
I'm going to the longer durée, right? I'm just like, deindustrialization and destruction of labor help facilitate the economic vulnerabilities that then subsequently people mobilize around. So the temporal thing, if you're looking for, it's not within a couple of years, it's over a couple of decades.
Okay, so let me pull Nealin into this. So Christian's laying a lot of tinder. You also laid a lot of tinder. You talked a lot about, sorry, Christian, now you're on mute. So Nealin gets to talk. So, you also laid a lot of tinder in your discussion about demographics and sort of the deep characteristics of our racial and political system that are setting us in a structure for violence. But obviously there's also moments of acuity where something lights that tinder. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, searches coming in because you're worried. You're seeing all these things that are structural factors that are making us more likely, just as Christian's talking about these sort of deep economic structural factors that make it more likely. But what are the things that you are particularly worried about, perhaps in the future, that could set this alight that we need to be thinking about or looking ahead toward?
So I think that we do have some experience with where there has been violence over the long haul, and actually some information even in this more recent period. So we know some of the patterns of police violence, of backlashes against, for example, protests. Black Lives Matter protests received more state and non-state violent responses. And in a sense, we can plan against some of that because there is some planning that goes with that. But I think one of the things that we're seeing in the United States is actually that a lot of the violence is not committed by organized groups. Some of it is, but in the non-state sector, some of it is committed by individuals who are inspired on their own or radicalized on their own, and commit that violence, and that's harder to plan against. But we do know that that elections in polarized contexts, affective polarized contexts, which is what we are in, are points of contention. And we know that in the last elections, both this past and the previous in 2020, there was a lot of discussion about the lack of validity, particularly in the tabulation period. And so I think that we can very comfortably look at least towards that as one place that there will be higher tensions, and that we should not anticipate that those tensions will manifest merely in what you think of as partisan violence, but that those end up being the times that you see increased violence against minorities, religious minorities, and increased violence against Black and Brown Americans, increased violence against sort of marginalized Americans in different ways. And so I think there are multiple things that you can plan against. That's one that has the feature of being a couple years in advance. And I just do want to say for the record, though, that elections also do play a role in diminishing violence, that they are a non gun-oriented way to have different opinions in this country. And so I don't want the interpretation to be, oh, well, if you will have a polarized election, then you should just not have an election. What you have to do then is to mitigate violence ahead of time.
Thank you. Very important public safety announcement. Democracy does tend to be much better than other systems in mitigating violence, whatever else we say. So I want to invite questions from the audience. We're already getting some questions, but I know others of you have them. So please do send them. One question that we're getting is, I think people are desperately wanting us to turn to what can be done. And as we hit the half-hour mark, it seems like a good moment to start pivoting from admiring the problem to solving it. And so I'm going to turn to Christian for the state and Nealin for citizenry. But Christian, you work a lot all over the world on how to perturb violence coming from the state, and citizen movements that can do that, and just in general, how you set up structures that can offset this violence from the state or alter that dynamic that goes back and forth. And I'd love to know how you would do that in the United States, or what tactics you think would be useful in the United States.
So, because I like Rachel so much, I will I'll roll with it. I generally rail against this, okay, let's get to the happy story thing, because we never spend enough time on actually understanding the problem. So I'll just say that. But perturbed state.
I'm admiring my audience. We're getting.
I understand that. I understand that. But this rush to kind of resolve is just kind of like, whoa, okay, really? I think the Phantom Toll Booth, I think my mother had me read as a child. It's like, Milo, we got to this problem by not thinking, so that we're going to get out of this problem by thinking. So I'm just like, okay. So the perturbance of force is actually really involving the citizens, right? So maybe I'm going to kind of where Nealin is, but the perturbance of the state, we can't keep relying upon the state to handle the problem. We just need to get the right person into the state, and then they'll handle it. I don't think that's going to work. So I think that, and specifically, I'll just talk about the topic of like police violence in particular. I think we really need to enter this age of like caveat civis. It's like, citizen beware, citizen be involved, citizen be engaged. And so we really need to help individuals figure out what the problem is. We need to help them figure out what options exist. We need to help them figure out how to select good options. We're not giving citizens tools to figure out exactly how to evaluate. We're just kind of letting them run with, okay, you have this opinion, and okay, now let's find a policy for it. Well, we're not working through the logic of whether or not that opinion actually leads to a policy, which actually leads to a change in the thing that we're trying to alter. So I think we need to kind of provide these tools for individuals to kind of figure out how to assess, how to evaluate, and how best to select, because I think there's some presumptions that are in this with regards to how things can get resolved that just aren't kind of like logically worked through. Like if we just get the right person in there, okay, that's not it. Okay, if we just have the right policy, okay, that's kind of not it either, because the policy making process has this evolution to it, and there's all types of additions and subtractions that come out, and by the end, it's not even close to kind of what we conceived of, and we need to kind of walk citizens through that. So I think, and I think if you consider where BLM took defund, took to restructure and reprioritize to the thing that it is now, which is kind of not moving anywhere. Folks forgot the conception of how complex policy making is as it relates to substantively changing a particular state practice and so forth. So I think we need to get people to think beyond elections. We need to think more broadly of the repertoire of activities we have available to us. Petitions, boycotts, protests, town halls, lobbying, think tanks, all of that needs to be uniformly brought together toward a particular end. And I think it happens generally in a very haphazard manner. And I think this is one of the reasons why the efforts get either deconstructed or they're not as effective as they could be. There's a whole literature on social movement efficacy, right? And that whole literature is based on the idea that social movements can come up with an idea that then finds its way into policy, that then results in X changing. It's like, okay, well, is that policy good for X? Was X warped as an idea in the first place, and that should have been the thing we're trying to change? And so literally this literature needs to kind of open up. And then the whole idea that social movements are good about getting things on an agenda, but it's not good for working through policies, which suggests that there's a whole other literature that needs to be like wedded into it. So the question of efficacy, as it relates back to my snarky remark initially, the idea of efficacy presumes that these different parts fit together and have been evaluated at comparable levels, which they haven't. So part of the idea of racing to the end, okay, what do we need to do? Just tell me what we need to do. Gets back to compassion fatigue, right? So I forget the author's name, but compassion fatigue was like, you know, if there's a problem and the solution is not really simple, people are going to lose focus and then drift off. Well, that's not really great for resolving a problem that is several hundred years old. And so we need to kind of really prepare individuals for, okay, you know what? If we're going to chip away at this problem, it's going the time dimension for that, the time horizon for that might be a little bit longer than you like. And so the pivoting is somewhat problematic, but I feel you.
This is why we're brothers from another mother, or sisters and brother from another, you know, because the social movement literature does suggest, and my own research suggests, it takes about 50 years to change some of these substantive things. Well, 50 years is, first of all, longer than most activists' lifetimes that they spend in activism. And it's certainly longer than a single defund the police movement. And that 50 years from idea conception to social change that you're actually looking for, as you said, goes through an awful lot of iteration and change and ugliness and backlash. And that process is just as difficult as the process that led us to the problem in the first place. And really, the literature is pretty sparse. And I agree with you, very really lacks thoughtfulness for anyone who's been in that world. I mean, a think tank is a perfect place to sit, where you're really in the messy middle of it all. And you see just how sparse the literature is. Christian, I'm going to come back to you to ask you to delve into the work that you've been doing on police in the US, because I think that's a really interesting starting point to start opening up some of this. But Nealin, I first want to bring you into this because you are more hopeful as a personality, I think. And in addition to the rise of this problem, we're seeing a lot of energy and resilience in our civil society that you have been right in the middle of, and helping organize a lot of that energy and resilience. And frankly, organize. No, she just really is a sunny personality. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what you see as going on that in terms of response. Not just that gives you hope. I don't want to be kind of hunky-dory about it, but what do you see in terms of response that as Search USA you're hoping to harness and hoping to bring together in some smart tactics over time?
I just want to say for the record that the last time that Christian and I were on any kind of a panel together, he was the sunshine and I was the doom. Thank you. So the depth of our feelings on this. I mean, it is the case that I've spent many nights up all night feeling anything but sunny. But when I think about all of the efforts that are being made, that is a place where I derive hope and strength, and a sense that these things can change and do change. So the Bridging Divides initiative has recorded 6,000 organizations that are part of a kind of response to violence in many forms. But one of the things that I am seeing is that there is a huge amount of effort, and Search is, as you said, a peace-building organization. The United States has one of the world's great sort of iconic peace-building movements in our civil rights movement, and there is a lot of that DNA that continues to operate today. There is a lot of work on democracy. There is a lot of work on police reform. There is a lot of variety, and I think that variety is critical. But one of the things that I'm seeing that is distinct from work that I did mostly in post-conflict, sort of after the formal cessation of hostilities, when there is a peace agreement in that period of time where you're trying to get to a long-term stable governance circumstance, there is a lot of what is called peace building done in that moment that draws from many different sectors, many different theories of change. So groups that are working on institutional reform, groups that are working on justice, groups that are working on de-escalation of conflict, all of those groups that have distinct pieces that they're trying to achieve, but that are working collectively with this war sitting behind them. And there's this sense of, we know what that looks like. We don't want to be in that. And that can be very motivating. And so groups that have very different, small, in a sense, smaller objectives, find it more easy to connect in an overall frame and work collectively and see how their work is working together. What I am seeing in the United States is what feels to me to be a bit more siloed. So you have groups that work on democracy that see themselves as distinct from groups that work on racial justice, that see themselves as distinct from peace builders. And I actually think all of these groups really work well together and in a sense, need to be working well together. I really appreciate what Christian said about the different tactics, about the importance of thinking outside of the state and of the citizenry, because I think, again, in this case, it's sort of where are there different, go to where you have any opening, any crack, any asset, and use all of the tools and all of the distinct parts of civil society together.
I really want to pull that thread a little bit, Nealin, because I was talking to a philanthropist yesterday about exactly the same problem that I saw, that he was asking about polarization in America, and I was saying that we actually don't have a lot of cases of countries as polarized as America in the way that America's polarized that have come out of it without a war. There are countries that had elite polarization that got out of it, England in the 80s and that kind of thing. But countries that have been as socially polarized as us have come out of it usually after a war. And that we're unlikely to have a civil war because countries that are as developed as America with as strong militaries as America actually rarely have civil wars. The literature on civil wars would suggest that we're more likely to have a kind of auto golpe, self-coup, kind of a Chile right before Pinochet and then Pinochet takeover sort of situation than a real civil war, because our state is too strong for a traditional civil war. I'm not saying I want a civil war. I'm just saying that, structurally we know what those look like, and they don't look like America. What we look like is a group that takes over a part of the country and uses that part of the country to achieve its aims. And so it's hard to see exactly how to get out of this kind of polarization without hitting rock bottom, when rock bottom is kind of hard to hit given the structure of our society. When I wrote my book, I called it the Italy problem. And looking at Italy and how it fought the mob, it can be hard when you're eating good pasta and looking out over these beautiful vistas and the weather's really nice to think that really your state is dying from within and the mob has taken over and organized criminals have gotten control of your politics. Does it really matter because the pasta is so good? And I don't mean to be totally facetious. I think it's really hard to galvanize social movements when people are at a certain level of complacency. It can be hard to keep people going for long enough at a certain level of complacency. And I think you're right that without a kind of war right behind you, it can be hard for social movements to say, you know what, we're not on exactly the same page, but there's a lot bringing us together. And so I think there's some need to kind of find a way together in America.
Could I
please
just as you know, my father's Chilean, and I was in Chile in 1988 and 89, and we were there. They bombed in our neighborhood, and we were caught in bombings, and there was violence at that time. There also was a democratic transition away from Pinochet and that autocracy, and it was one of those situations that everyone said was impossible. There's no way that he's going to leave. He does not have the incentives to do that. And then he did. The Berlin Wall was impossible. It was never going to come down. And then it did. And that use of the hitting rock bottom, I usually associate with alcoholism and how you have to hit rock bottom before you go back up. And I think that's actually a really interesting use of that term, because rock bottom isn't a place. It isn't war. It isn't a sort of defined, these are the things that have to happen in your life for you to be at rock bottom and turn around. It is by definition the place where you decided to turn around. And I think that's relevant for the United States as well. We have had crises. We will have more crises. The question is, which of those is a turning point? And I think that there is evidence that these things can be turning points, and that it does not have to be war of a particular level of violence, or horror of a particular level, for that to be that turning point.
From your mouth to God's ears is what my people say. And I think you're right. And I think it's important to come to that turning point earlier rather than later. I think there is a group of people who have been at war in this country in terms of levels of violence for a long time. And that's obviously our African-American population. And the particular problems with the police are very long-standing there. And I think Christians' work on ways out of that are really interesting, because they do offer some hope and some inflection points that are grounded in some practical reality that I don't think you were actually thinking you would find when you started doing that research, although maybe I'm wrong about that. So I'd love for you to take a minute maybe to talk about that research that you're doing, because I think it offers the kind of practical suggestions that I would love to see some of our social movements. I know we've got a lot of folks on the call who come from a social movement background. I'd love to see some of them, frankly, steal your research, call you up, and start working with you on it, because I think it's so important and such a good starting place.
Thank you for that. Hopefully we get a chance to talk about this polarization bit. I don't think we're as polarized, which is kind of related to the point. I think we are at war, again, to repeat that. And the whole Civil War thing is just killing me. I'm just like, it's less Hobbes than Delabotee is what's going to happen. So this Civil War is going to, whatever. Okay, so the police thing really was to address this whole idea. So most police departments in the United States have a use of force policy. And someone is always kind of familiar with it, in the sense that it's normally set up in the following. If a citizen engages in a particular activity, it identifies what the police officer should do in response. The thing that I found interesting was, like, ordinary people are rarely asked exactly what they think is a reasonable or appropriate response. And then if you flip it, okay, if the police do something, what should ordinary people do? No one's asking that, because we're just supposed to be compliant and just basically take it. And so the research project that I have really kind of sought out to explore exactly what is ordinary people's perceptions of use of force in both directions. And so the thing that became interesting for us was, so like, what should police do in facing ordinary people? And what should ordinary people do in facing police? So literally, if anyone thinks of the George Floyd interaction with Chauvin in the murder, think of the individual standing on the street. There's like 10 or 11 people watching this thing. What should and could they have done is kind of like where we're trying to push in many respects. But what became interesting was, once you start, and not like, you know, do you believe that people should engage in violent and nonviolent activities? It's like specifics. Do you believe that an officer of the law should put a knee on the back of an ordinary person? Do you believe that police, in confronting a crowd, should use pepper spray? I mean, like, literally, we're trying to get the tactics, because this gets to the idea of what is violence, right? And exploring exactly how that varies. What was intriguing from the results, and I think where Rachel was trying to go, was the similarities with regards to what individuals believe to be an appropriate response to different activities, reveals that there's way more similarities across individuals than this polarization narrative about we've got separate worlds and people are seeing things very differently. The degree of statistical insignificance across categories. Like, no one believes the police should just be unloading on somebody with live fire if they're using graffiti on a building. There are situations where people believe the police should shoot, and it normally involves in response to someone shooting at them. But off of that particular diagonal, the parameters on that allowance are very limited. And I think these similarities serve as a basis for, if we're trying to figure out what people can mobilize around, then we need to get to the whole things that people are more or less seeing in similar ways. Just like I would make the comment that, like, Maslow's the lower part of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, food, clothing, shelter, that's where people are going to be unified. Once we hit meaning in a whole bunch of these higher order categories, then there might be some divisions. But if we focus on those things, and so in a similar light, the investigations that we were doing with regards to the police were as much to explore where the cutoffs existed and where people thought was what was appropriate, what wasn't appropriate. But we were exploring racial differences. We were exploring party differences. We were exploring economic differences, gender differences, and we were finding so much similarity with regards to what individuals were doing. Now we need to explore a little bit more with exactly what's the race of the police officer, what's the race of the victim, or what's the race of the citizen, as to how that influences your opinion, because we were extracting away from that. And we're hoping that we're not finding any effect there. Well, of course, we expect that we might, given where things were going. And so we think this kind of decomposition is actually necessary in order to find common ground, actually, to use Nealin's idea, right? I mean, and part of this is because left, right, Republican, Democrat are so loaded with so many different and contradictory things that if we're trying to find exactly where people could come together, we actually need to decompartmentalize these broader encompassing ideas and understanding that they're multidimensional in nature anyway. And with that unpacking, we could actually find the pieces that fit together, and that serves as the basis for building a coalition. And I'm not a hopeful person, but once we saw the data on this, we were just like, okay, you know what? We could actually get to a point of mobilization and common ground once we step away from these labels, once we step away from these gross categorizations of political ideas and realities, which are incredibly complex when you get down to, okay, but what does that look like actually on the ground? And so I think that's what Rachel was referring to. And that's definitely the kind of bizarrely optimistic space that we're in as we're trying to kind of like now use that as a basis for mobilization.
What I love about this research project is not just that you found this very hopeful set of facts, although that's obviously very good, but also that it's really the basis of a new social contract between citizens and the state. And for those of us who are democracy comparative scholars, I mean, our democracy, long before we started talking about political violence, long before Nealin, in fact, got me on this trajectory of political violence, because it was her chance remark that set me off on this 3-year loop of my career. But prior to that, our democracy was in real trouble. And you saw that in all sorts of statistics about people moving away from the political parties, about people seeing the system as rigged, about the lack of trust. All sorts of things that showed that the system had a lot of rot, but that the institutions were kind of holding themselves up as these facades that were containing it. And what's nice about this kind of experiment with the police is that if you could do almost a town hall, almost a kind of a democratic, what's Fishkin's work, the democracy in one room sort of type of thing, you can envision an actual conversation at a town level, because our police operate at that level. And so it's a functional level to have the conversation with police, where you have a new social contract talking about use of force. It's not about the defunding of the police, but it's about what citizens expect of their police and what police expect of citizens, where the law and the expectations are quite clear on both sides. And that kind of social contractual rebuilding is clearly really necessary in our democracy. And the problem of force, as Nealin was pointing out, is coming out of this incredible frustration with being able to solve problems in a lot of other ways that aren't getting solved. That's what we see in all sorts of countries that are having this kind of force. So Nealin, I want to pull your background into this as well. And please, we have 5 more minutes. I don't want to ignore our questioners here. So actually, let me look at the questions before I pull you in with the question I was going to ask. So people are wondering about some of the political violence that we're concerned about in 2024, and whether you're worried about efforts to foment that in 2024 and what we can do about it. And I know Search is, and you personally have been involved in efforts to think about this. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I do want to have a chance just to say, Christian, that I hope that we continue the conversation about being at war. I suspect we actually agree a lot more than it sounds like, but the way that I was thinking of the use of that word is, what strings do we still have to pull? What programming, in a sense, what responses can we utilize now? And And I do feel like we have a lot of, we still have a lot that we can do. As this relates to the question that we can do that is actually more constrained that can be more constrained. But having said that, I am worried about 2024. And I think that think about it this way. So we saw violence after 2020. We saw violence that when we lived through it was really uncertain how it was going to land. And then we did not have a constitutional crisis, and we moved on, and a new president was peacefully inaugurated, and life continued. But there have not been, in my view, overarching fundamental changes in the trajectory that we were on prior to that election. So we still have the same low levels of trust in those institutions. We arguably have an experience in 2020 and 2022 that may have made people feel less worried about it, because we did manage to pull through in those elections. And so there can be some complacency there that prevents you from doing some of the mitigation work that actually makes it possible to be resilient and pull through those elections. So the things that you would want to see now, I'll give a couple of thoughts. One is leadership matters. That leadership can be the political parties, but when it is not the political parties, it can be citizens. And often it is citizens, people in local places around the country who say, not in my town. The other is that preparation matters. So if I'll just give examples of things that might happen in other countries that might be relevant here. So one is having everybody know what is supposed to happen in an election. Training police on what is the electoral law, so that they know, is somebody allowed to have a gun in here or not? That can actually mitigate violence if everybody understands, here's what's possible. Having journalists trained in, here's what's okay in an election, here's what's okay in security, here's what's not okay in these things. Having laws decided well ahead of time that allow for things like election observation, that address issues of confusion. I think we are very short on time, so I will stop right there. But just to say that there is a lot to be concerned about, but there is also a lot of work that is being done right now to support those elections.
Oops. You're on mute. I know. It's got to happen. We're almost out of time, and we have an audience question about the role of law enforcement in fomenting organized political violence. I was going to turn that over to Christian, but I'm actually going to just say that it is complicated, I believe. I think the history of law enforcement in the United States is one of working with citizenry, and citizen violence and law enforcement violence have connections in our country in terms of leaning to one side and encouraging one side. You also see that in other countries that sometimes you get direct law enforcement incitement, like with DHS going to Portland. But sometimes you also get just a sense of more understanding. And we've certainly seen in the ACLID data that there's been much more use of force against left-wing protests that are peaceful and so on in our country. I'm sure Christian has things that he wants to say. But I want to wrap up. We only have one more minute. So Christian, feel free to speak on that. Nealin, feel free to speak on that. But I just want to give you each a chance to say one last thing in one last minute about whatever topic you'd like as we finish up. So I'll turn to Christian first and then to Nealin.
I liked the Tino intervention, so I'll kind of go there. I think the biggest problem that we're confronting in many respects is a limited imagination, a limited understanding, and so of kind of like of where we are and what's involved, where we'd like to go, and how we get there. And on the positive, optimistic part of that spin of kind of, well, the U.S. still has, I'm going to say the strangest thing, which is the U.S. still has science fiction. Mainstream political discussion is not giving us a sense of what that beloved community could look like at the end. But there's enough information out there in Octavia Butler and other aspects of culture to give us a sense of what is possible. And we need to start occupying that space, because if we keep paying attention to the same things, let's just get somebody involved. Let's repair the damaged ship that is the political party. Then we're never going to get to the better improved existence that we could possibly have.
Thank you. That was beautiful, Christian. And Nealin, the Tino question is from a conversation Christian and I had before with Tino, our now president. I'm particularly troubled by blank, but at least the United States still has blank. So can you answer that, and then we'll cut out.
I am particularly troubled by where we stand, but we still have a lot of choice. You're still on mute.
I'm still on mute. We could have this conversation all day, not on mute, but we have to let our audience go. So thank you very much for joining me. I will say bye-bye, and hope you'll all join us next time for the next Carnegie Open Studio.